Todd, as always, it's wonderful having you here, and we're here to talk about some good news. Quite often, we're talking about negative news because of persecution around the globe. In this case, Eritrea, it's a country some people might not be familiar with, and we can get into some of the ins and the outs of persecution there. But there were recently some Christians, 13 Christians, who had been detained for about a decade who were released in that country. Tell us a little bit about this story.
Well, this is an amazing answer to prayer and amazing praise the Lord for 13 Christians in Eritrea, 6 men, 7 women to be released from prison. As you mentioned, all 13 of them at least 10 years in prison. For them to be released is an amazing blessing. And it's interesting because just 6 days before they were released, Voice of the Martyrs launched a campaign on behalf of 2 pastors who were spending their 7,000th day in prison. So they were arrested more than 19 years ago. They've been in prison all that time. We asked people to pray for them and for other Christians imprisoned in Eritrea. We asked people to contact the Eritrean embassy on their behalf. And lo and behold, 6 days later, 13 Christians walk out of prison in Eritrea. It's hard not to see those two things as connected.
Yeah, I mean, 6 days. And this speaks to the importance of the work that you do at Voice of the Martyrs, because this is very difficult work. The persecution issue is raging around the globe. You and I have talked many times about this before. How common is it that you see that sort of pressure being put on a country, and for that quick of a turnaround, presumably to see these 13 people being released, again, less than a week after you started that effort?
Well, it's interesting to kind of wonder about that because obviously the Eritrean government is not going to say, hey, Voice of the Martyrs did this, and so we're going to let these people go. I was in Eritrea in 2004, and it's interesting. One of the pastors, I was just recently going back through my notes from that trip. One of the pastors at that time said, if you could get the U.S. president to call our president, just one phone call, it would make a huge difference. But that hasn't necessarily been the case. The Eritrea has been identified as a country of particular concern by the State Department repeatedly over the years since then. And that international pressure hasn't seemed to make a difference when it came to religious freedom. So again, it's hard to know what role different things play. Government pressure, people praying, people writing letters to the embassy, sending faxes to the embassy. It's hard to know how that all plays into 13 Christians walking out of prison.
Yeah, well, and again, like you said, the government's not going to say, "Oh, thanks, Christians, you made this happen," right? But the fact that you embarked on this, and we should note the 2 church leaders. Tell us a little bit about them. They were not among the 13 who were released, correct?
One of the things that is really sad for me is that Pastor Haile Naiski, Dr. Kiflu Gebremeskel, the 2 church leaders who were in prison 7,000 days, that's now, I think we're up to like 7,020 now, they are still in prison. They were not among these 13 that were released. I continue to encourage people, please pray for them. Please pray for their release as well. And they're not alone. Our estimates are somewhere between 350 and 400 Christians still in prison in Eritrea. And as I mentioned, every time I talk about this, not a single one of those Christians has had a trial or had a lawyer, had a chance to defend themselves or represent their side of the story. In fact, not a single one of them has been formally charged with a crime. They simply get arrested, they disappear into the prison system. And in the case of Pastor Haile and Dr. Kiflu, it's now been 7,000 days that they've been in that prison system, away from their family, away from their friends, simply for being followers of Jesus Christ, simply for working in the church in Eritrea.
Well, that was going to be my question. And what is the allegation against them? I mean, what is the government saying they've done?
The challenge for Christians, and this is interesting because President Afwerki, the president of Eritrea, was educated in China under the communist system there. And so it seems that he has kind of brought with him that distrust of religion. And so the knock against Christians, or the reputation against Christians in the government, is they're not patriotic. They love Jesus more than they love their country, which hopefully that's true of all of us who love
Right.
Jesus. yes, we do love Jesus more than our country. That doesn't mean we're not patriotic. It doesn't mean we don't love our country. But that's really how Christians are perceived in Eritrea, as they're not patriotic citizens. They're not good citizens. They're a threat to the government. That's why so many are locked in prison.
And these 13 who are released, I know their identities are not being revealed for security reasons, obviously. They spent 10 years behind bars. Were there any official charges ever? It seems like possibly not. And if so, do we know what they were specifically charged with?
There are no charges. In fact, no single Christian in Eritrea has been charged with a crime.
So that is so foreign to us.
It is completely unjustified. It is, as you say, to us, it's almost incomprehensible. Like, how can you hold somebody for 19 years without even charging them with a crime? That's the reality, though, in Eritrea is there's no recourse. There's no trial. There's no way to fight against the charges. And one of the really frustrating things, and again, as we think about this as Westerners, is they don't know how long they're going to be in prison. There is no prison sentence that they're trying to serve out and get to their final day. They could be released tomorrow, or they could not be released ever, or they could be released 10 years from now. They never know how long they're going to be there. And I think, as we think about praying for them, I think that's one of the things we can pray for, is just for a hopefulness and a sense of encouragement that God would give to them, because they have so many unanswered questions.
Yeah, I can't imagine living with that sort of fear. You're at the whim of a government official or government officials. You're forgotten in prison, and you're there for doing nothing. You're there for nothing more than exercising what we would call your rights, here in the West and here in America. When you look at this and you look around the world at some of the patterns of what's happening when it comes to persecution, what does it show you, especially this particular instance where you guys went out there at the 7,000 day mark, you encouraged prayer? What does this situation show you about the power and the importance of being prayerful and hopeful, even in the midst of these difficult circumstances?
I think one of the things that we will hopefully take out of this is how we need to pray for imprisoned Christians around the world. We set up a website. More than 16,000 people have said, I'm going to pray for Christians who are in prison in Eritrea. The fact that went live on a Saturday and the following Friday, 13 Christians were set free, I think shows the importance and the power of our prayers. The other thing that happened is we encouraged people to contact the Eritrean embassy, and we know that happened. We actually heard from some of our viewers who said, hey, I tried to email the embassy. Their email address is bouncing back. Apparently, either their box was completely full, or perhaps they turned off the email server because they were getting so much email. But obviously they noticed the fact that, hey, people are writing to us about these two Christians in prison. People are aware of what we're doing to Christians in prison. Most of these governments don't want that kind of light shined on the persecution that they are doing to our brothers and sisters. And so when that light does shine, when the world is aware and we make it obvious, hey, people in more than 100 countries are praying for these pastors who are in prison. People in multiple countries are sending emails to the Eritrean embassy saying, hey, let these people go. They are obviously noticing the fact that this is not happening in secret. This is not happening in the darkness. The world is aware of this. And I think that does have an influence, even if it's a subtle influence, even with a government like Eritrea, that I think if you ask them, they would say, well, we don't care what the rest of the world thinks. But the reality is they obviously do care.
Yeah, that's why that pressure is so important, especially it takes time sometimes to chip away. And who knows the motivation here? I believe prayer is powerful. I think it had a massive impact. It's unfortunate that the two pastors weren't included, but for those 13, it's incredible. My final question for you, I am by no means, and I've said this to you in the past, I say it to everybody when I talk about persecution, comparing what is happening in America or the West to anything going on in a place like Eritrea. Yet I look at this and I say, gosh, a country doesn't become Eritrea overnight. No country has that level of persecution overnight. What does this show us? We talked about prayer, but now let's talk about practicality. when it comes to our actions, what we need to do just to make sure that we continue to enjoy freedoms. And that's not just for America, but for any country that has any sort of religious freedom. What steps need to be taken to ensure that that continues?
Well, I think one of the things we need to do is recognize the freedoms that we have, and we need to take advantage of them. We are completely free to go to our neighbors and knock on their door and offer them a Gospel of John, offer them, hey, could I pray with you about any needs that you have? We're completely free to do that, but how many of us do it? And I point the finger at myself as well. How many of us do that? So before we worry about losing our freedoms, let's make sure we're using them. Let's make sure we're taking advantage of the freedoms that we have. And certainly we have on the political spectrum, we have freedoms to have a voice. We have freedoms to vote. Let's use those freedoms and let's speak out for religious freedom in our own country, as well as the more than 70 countries where Christians face persecution as a matter of course in their life of following Jesus.
Well, absolutely. And just to sort of reframe one of the words, I use the word practicality. Prayer is the most practical thing we can do. I think the better word the word that I meant there was actionable, right? What is an actionable thing outside of prayer that we can do? And I appreciate you explaining that and bringing us through it, because I think the world's in a precarious place right now and we need to be talking about these stories. I'm glad we were able to talk about a positive element here with the work that you do. Todd, as always, appreciate your time.
Thanks so much for having me. And I join you. I celebrate the release of these 13, and I pray many more Eritrean Christians are out of jail soon.